Well, good morning to you all. Our passage for today, our title is Living Witnesses, and key verse is a very well-known one, right slap bang in the middle of this passage. Peter says, "In your hearts set apart Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have." And I hardly need to say that if ever people around us needed hope, it's today. Lying politicians, environmental disaster, and the seemingly endless story of COVID, to name just three big subjects that feel like they oppress us and might well lead us to despair. People need hope today. And I'm going to come back to that passage in due course, because this whole passage in 1 Peter from verse 8 to 22, which Ruth read for us, it is very much about hope. It's also got some very challenging passages. It starts with fairly straightforward about sympathy, love, tenderheartedness. And then it goes through Noah's Ark, gets to imprisoned spirits, and ends up with baptism. It seems to make quite a journey there, and it's perhaps a little mysterious as to what exactly Peter is getting at. And I hope to perhaps demystify it a little bit over the course of the next 10 minutes or so. Let's start at the beginning. Finally, all of you have unity of spirit, sympathy, love for one another, a tender heart. No one can argue with these things. We might have trouble putting them into practice, but no one could argue that these are good things. But then he adds, and a humble mind. Peter's Gentile readers, and most of his readers would have been Gentiles, would sit up and be thinking, humility? That's not something we in Greek culture value very much. The Greeks, common with most of the pagan world, associated humility with humiliation, being of a low estate, being poor, being downtrodden. That's what humility was all about. The Jews had got hold of something more positive as they separated the idea of humility from humiliation. And in Proverbs 29, for example, 23, a man's pride brings him low, but a man of lowly spirit gains honour. So the Jews certainly valued humility, and we Christians need to value it too. That's something Jesus was very, very strong on. But now we get into very distinctive Jesus territory. No one before Jesus much really could get a hold of this. Do not repay evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay with a blessing. So Jesus is the one who, particularly in the Sermon on the Mount, really instructed his disciples very clearly to not repay evil for evil, to love their enemies. And then, of course, when he went to the cross, he demonstrated how to do it in a very supremely amazing way. But Peter then brings out his key text for the day, and he introduces, he says, on the contrary, repay with a blessing. For this that you were called, that you might inherit a blessing. And then he quotes Psalm 34 that we were listening to earlier, and in particular, verses 12 to 14. It's his text for the day. Those who desire life and desire to see good days, let them keep their tongues from evil and their lips from speaking deceit. Let them turn away from evil and do good. Let them seek peace and pursue it. For the eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their prayer. But the face of the Lord is against those who do evil. It's standard stuff from the Old Testament. The righteous will prosper and the wicked will perish or suffer. And Peter then goes on to ask the question, now who will harm you if you are eager to do what is good? And we might be tempted at this point to smile wryly and think, Peter, are you having a laugh? Peter, whose master Jesus was crucified for doing good. Peter himself is about not very long after this going to get crucified himself. Many Christians have already been martyred for doing good. But no, Peter insists, who will harm you if you, and he explains what he means, even if you suffer for doing what is right, you are blessed, he says. And then he explains, do not fear what they fear, and do not be intimidated. Well, what is it that they fear? They, the world. Looking bad, losing possessions, losing credibility, and losing control. Those are probably the things that most people fear, especially rulers who are a little bit brutal. But do not be intimidated, he says, but, and what does he set against those fears? He said, but in your hearts sanctify Christ as Lord. That's the thing you should be afraid of, Peter says. Letting your master down. Letting him down, that's the only thing you should be afraid of. Do not fear what they fear. And he goes on, always be ready to make your defence to anyone who demands from you an account of the hope that is in you. It's a challenge to us, isn't it? Hope is an experience thing. It's not just about a set of beliefs. It's about a living experience. Despite all that's around us, all that might drag us down to despair. The question to you today is, are we still the people of hope? I sat in Pentry yesterday. Well, it's not yesterday. It's yesterday when I'm doing this recording. And I was just sitting with a young 9-year-old Muslim lad who, while his mum went and did some shopping. For about 10 minutes, I had this almost incessant, very impressive, almost incessant monologue explaining to me what the Quran taught about heaven and hell and angels and demons and all manner of things. And in particular, he wanted me to know why Christians had got it a little bit wrong about Jesus. And it was kind of curious to know how to respond. How do I respond? And it made me think of this this next phrase. He says, always be ready to give an account of the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and reverence. As a matter of fact, his mum and I had been chatting a little bit about religion before this, and her comments were very much full of gentleness and reverence and respect and a desire to connect rather than to confront. And it makes me think too that sometimes maybe I do think that the tone of what we say and how we say it speaks far louder than the actual words we say. There was very little I felt I could say in this context. Getting a word in edgeways was hard enough. So I just listened, occasionally just acknowledged what he was saying, and I did ask him a slightly challenging question just at one point, but I tell you what I wasn't going to do. I wasn't going to argue with him. We never win people's hearts through arguments. Never. Just doesn't work. Gentleness and reverence, these are much more powerful tools. Keep your conscience clear, says Peter, so that when you are maligned, those who abuse you for your good conduct in Christ may be put to shame. For it is better to suffer for doing good, if suffering should be God's will, than to suffer for doing evil. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, in order to bring you to God. He was put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. And this is the reason for our hope. It's the reason for my hope. Very simple. Jesus rose from the dead. And Peter and his friends, a host of other witnesses, tell us this. And you know these guys. You know these guys who had these high moral standards. These are the ones that are telling us. We saw him. We touched him with our own hands. We saw him with our own eyes. And I believe them. And that is why I have hope. And here's where the passage gets a little bit more tricky, but it's saying something very, very important. He was made alive in the Spirit, in which he also went and made a proclamation to the spirits in prison, who in former times did not obey God when God waited patiently in the days of Noah, during the building of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 people, were saved through water. Where does the ark come into it? Just very quickly, there was a very strong tradition in Israel that believed that the reason for the flood was, it's very clear at the beginning of Genesis 6, that it says the sons of God had sexual relations with the sons of men, it says. There have been some deep and inappropriate connection between the spirit world and humanity. And that, in Israel's belief, was the reason for the flood. It was a mixing up of the powers of darkness with human beings that caused the major problem. And Peter would most likely have believed that in his time, that the demonic activity and the expressions of demonic activity that came around the time of Jesus would have been like the fallout, the intergenerational fallout from what happened all that time ago. But being thoroughly conquered now by Jesus, being pushed back by Jesus. So when Jesus goes and preaches to the spirits in prison, not human beings, I think, but I think angelic beings are being envisaged here. He is going out into the cosmos to proclaim the victory of Jesus through the resurrection throughout the entire cosmos. He is reversing what happened at the time of the ark. Now, God, of course, had his way of dealing with that at the time, in purifying the world, but those forces, it appears, were still there in the cosmos. And now, at this time, Jesus goes and proclaims his victory to them. Now, there's an open question here. Is he just proclaiming victory, or is he once again inviting them to participate in his massive redemptive power? Quite frankly, I don't know. But we'll come back to it in a second. But because now he makes a reference to baptism. He says, a few, that is 8, were saved through water, and baptism, which this prefigured, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers made subject to him. What is he saying is that just as Noah and his friends were saved from all of this horrific stuff that was going on, where the powers of darkness were getting at a grip on humanity, so one by one, you can come into the community of those who are being saved, the community of those who have Jesus as their master, Jesus who has conquered the entire powers of darkness through the power of his resurrection. And that is why we can have hope. And that is why we can live with hope and share that hope with people who have good reason to despair. Let's live in hope. Let's stay connected to the community of hope, which believes these things, which believes you can live in this way, and believes that Jesus is ultimately going to have the victory. Amen.